So right now we have the virtual meeting guidelines. I'm sure folks have seen these before. Why don't we take it? Do you want to just do a quick reminder to everyone, and then I'll read the accessibility statement.
Absolutely. So just as a reminder to everyone, you have joined with muted microphones, and it will be the host, Matt Archer, will be muting and unmuting you as you raise your hand to ask questions. Please do try to avoid to mute yourself, because if you do, then you will have to approve being unmuted in the future. So if at all possible, please let him perform the actions of muting and unmuting you. Please do rename yourself when you join. It is very helpful. Please include MPO member in your affiliation if you are a board member. And when we do the roll call and when you have a question, use the raise hand function to raise your name to the top of the list, which makes it easier for us to find you. You can find the raise hand function if you click on the participants button at the bottom of your screen, and you will pull up a window, a list of participants, and there is a raise hand button at the bottom of that list of participants that you can push. I believe, and then I should also just mention for those on the phone, you can raise your hand by dialing *9. I think that is enough, Steve.
Thank you, Tegan. All right, Matt, can you put up the accessibility statement? Great. This meeting is accessible to people with disabilities. Zoom products are compliant with exceptions with the following standards: Web Content Accessibility Guidelines 2.1, level AA standards, and revised section 508 standards. If you require any additional accommodations in order to participate fully in this meeting, please contact Roisin Foley, MPO staff at rfoley@ctps.org or 857-702-3704. All right. So thanks, Matt. The agenda, first item, agenda introductions. Jonathan, I believe, will read the roll call. So Jonathan, are you there?
Yes, I am. Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I will do the roll call. Mass DOT seat 1 chair.
I'm Steve Wolfel, representing Secretary and CEO of MassDOT, Stephanie Pollock.
Pardon me, just an interruption. If I just as a reminder, if all MPO members can please raise your hand, it'll make it easier for us to find you in the list. And then thank you. Please continue.
Thank you, Tegan. MassDOT DOT seat 2.
John Bouchard, representing Highway Administrator Jonathan Gulliver.
Mass DOT Highway.
Here, John Romano, Mass DOT Highway.
Okay, thank you, sir. MBTA.
Samantha Silverberg, MBTA.
Thank you. Massport.
Laura Gilmore with the Massachusetts Port Authority.
Thank you. MAPC.
Good morning. This is Eric Barassa with the Metropolitan Area Planning Council.
Thank you. MBTA Advisory Board.
Good morning, Brian Kane, MBTA Advisory Board.
Thank you. Regional Transportation Advisory Council.
Leonard Higgins with the Advisory Council.
Thank you. Good morning. City of Boston, Boston Transportation Department.
Tom Kansas, Boston. Tom Kansas, City of Boston, representing Mayor Martin Walsh.
Thank you. Good morning. City of Boston BPDA.
Jim Fitzgerald with BPDA, representing Mayor Walsh, City of Boston.
Thank you. City of Everett.
Jay Monty, City of Everett, representing Mayor DeMaria.
Thank you. City of Newton.
David Kozas, at-large city, representing Mayor Ruth Ann Fuller, City of Newton.
Thank you. Town of Arlington.
Daniel Amstutz, Town of Arlington, at-large town MPO member.
Okay. At-large Town of Lexington.
At-large town, Lexington.
Could you repeat your name, please?
Oh, I'm sorry, Sheila Page.
Oh, thank you. I didn't catch it with the muting. Intercore Somerville.
Bent, City of Somerville, Intercore, representing Mayor Joe Curtatone.
Thank you, Tom. Magic Acton. Okay. Metro West, Framingham.
Mayor Spicer, Metro West.
Could you repeat your name, please?
Thatcher, Keyser.
Thank you. Didn't catch it with the muting. North Shore, Beverly. Okay.
I'm here.
Oh.
Yep, sorry, we're waiting to get unmuted. Darlene Nguyen, representing Mayor Michael Cahill.
Thank you. North Suburban, Woburn.
Good morning. This is Tina Cassidy, representing the North Suburban Planning Council and Woburn Mayor Scott Galvin.
Thank you. South Shore, Rockland. Okay. Swap, Medway. Okay. And finally, Trek, Norwood, NRRC.
Tom O'Rourke from the town of Norwood, representing the Trek subregion.
Thank you very much. That calls the roll, Mr. Chair.
All right, Jonathan, thank you very much. Next item on the agenda is agenda item 2, Chair's Report. I do not have one. Next item agenda is agenda item 3, Executive Director's Report. Tegan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I want to start off with just a few update items. First of all, for those of you that recall, the 2019 Federal Certification Review final report documented 2 corrective actions for the Boston Region MPO to complete, as well as a number of recommendations. And those corrective actions involved developing a fully compliant list of obligated projects, which involves some minor modifications, as well as an updated air quality MOU. We completed these by December 2019, but we were recertified conditionally pending that completion, and we received a letter 2 weeks ago that FHWA and FTA acknowledged the completion of those 2 corrective actions. So now the Boston MPO is formally recertified. And that said, we do continue to work on implementing the recommendations in that report, the elections process discussion being one of them that we're talking about today. And we also provide quarterly reports on our progress to FHWA and FTA. So formally certified, great. I did want to highlight one outreach activity from this week that I thought was quite successful. On Tuesday, we co-hosted, Boston Region MPO staff co-hosted with MEPC, a forum called Essential Trips, a COVID-19 response discussion for local transit providers. And at that forum, the intent was to give regional transit authorities, RTAs, transportation management associations, TMAs, councils on aging, and other transportation providers a chance to discuss the challenges, the adaptations they were making, the policies they were putting in place, and their successes during this COVID-19 situation. We had 4 speakers. They were Monica Tibbetts-Nutt, representing 128 Business Council, Susan Barrett for the town of Lexington, which offers Lexpress, Ms. Cheryl Brooks from Transaction Associates, and Rachel Fichtenbaum from Mass Mobility. And then we had over an hour conversation following. So I think it was really great. And if you'd like to see a discussion, it will be posted, a video or recording of the meeting will be posted on our YouTube channel. And outreach staff can always direct you to that. Okay, so today we will have less lengthy presentations and more conversation. So I hope that will be exciting for you all. We do need you to weigh in because there will be a number of choices about how you want to move forward with certain items. So first, Eric Barassa with MABC will talk to you about the elections process and talk about a survey. And again, that's kind of linked to our federal certification review recommendations. And then various board members, chairs, and staff will give you an overview of the 3 MPO committees. Those committees meet sort of intermittently outside of the board meetings, and our hope is to sort of gain more membership or bolster membership or renew membership as needed for those committees. So please let us know if you're interested in them. And then we have a more in-depth conversation about the major infrastructure category and the long-range transportation plan. This has been coming up again as certain Complete Streets project have crossed what you had established in the past as the $20 million threshold for the major infrastructure category. So Anne's going to give you kind of an overview and some thoughts and some options to consider so that you have something to sort of react to and hopefully determine what next steps you want to take. And then finally, for your discussion and deliberation, Andrew Clark will talk about some options to modify what was the approved 2020 street study that was called the Transit Mitigation for New Developments. As is the case with some of these kind of timely and evolving study topics, they can become redundant with other work going on, and that's been the case with this work. So Andrew's going to suggest a few ways to rethink the use of that $60,000 for you to consider. And lastly, I wanted to make sure that you're aware that this actually will be Andrew Clark's last presentation to the MPO. You may recall he's presented on some really interesting topics like future of the curb and the ongoing successful shuttle program. And we do have staff ready to take over his work, but I wanted you to know that he would be leaving us and moving on to go to the Greater Portland Council of Governments GP COG. And we wish him a lot of luck there. So I think that's it for today. I will say that we may be proposing some additional changes to the schedule in June and July, but I don't have that information for you yet, but we will come back to you at the next MPO meeting to discuss that and see if that works for you. And that is all I have, Mr. Chair.
All right, thanks, Tegan. Any questions for Tegan?
Mr. Chair,
before we,
Mr. Chair, one quick thing. I failed to ask if there were any ex officio members present during the roll call, and I noted in the list that Mr. Miller is here.
Yep, that's what I was about to say, Joe. It's perfect. All right, we're on agenda item 4, public comments. Are there any members of the public who would like to address the MPO today? Do we have any, Matt?
Not seeing any at the moment.
All right, so next agenda is agenda item 5, committee chairs reports. There are committee chairs who want to give an update. I'm assuming we probably want to hear, is this where we want to hear from Brian Kane? So Brian, do you want to give a couple comments? I've heard you want to, so why don't you take the floor?
Thank you, Steve. Really appreciate it. So folks might have heard that a longtime MPO member, Paul Regan, has recently retired as executive director of the MBTA Advisory Board. Paul retired effective March 31st. It was a long-planned retirement, although the pandemic has caused him, at my request, to stay on a little longer as an advisor to me in these crazy times, and I really do appreciate that. Paul is definitely a mentor of mine in my career in transportation. He got me started in this career field. Sometimes I thank him for that, and other times I curse him for that, but mostly thank him. He served on the MPO for 21 years through multiple efforts and multiple tips and CIPs and everything else. So he definitely is a loss for this body in terms of his institutional knowledge. We will appropriately honor Paul at some point as an advisory board and hopefully as an MPO. If need be, we will send state troopers to drag him back, which that might be what it takes, because he is definitely enjoying his retirement. Every time I talk to him, he's either woodworking or walking his dog, which is what he plans to do in retirement. But he will be back at times to be appropriately honored. And I did want to note that the MassDOT board appropriately honored Paul last Monday, presenting him with some accolades and a couple of mementos. And I'm sure that we will do the same when the time is appropriate. But Steve, I do appreciate the opportunity to speak and just let everyone know that Paul is retired, but he still is active. And if there is anyone that wants to reach out to him, I'd be happy to share his contact information. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Brian. And obviously, he was well respected and done a lot of great work with the MPO. Tegan, I know you want to say something too, so.
Yeah, in general, I just want to say that we'll work with the board to figure out how best you would like to, express your thoughts to him. Maybe we can talk about that a bit more in advance of and then at the next board meeting. So there's things we can facilitate doing, and even in this environment of the stay at home, work from home situation. I did want to also mention that Paul, among many things that he did, was also chair of the A&F committee. Haral will be talking a little bit more about the A&F committee in this meeting during that agenda item, and we'll need to work with the board to discuss what will make sense to replace the chairing of the A&F committee. It was actually Paul and not the advisory board who was chairing it, so we'll need sort of an individual replacement, and we'll work with Brian, we'll work with the board board to understand what might make most sense.
Thank you, Tegan. Just to follow up on that, as obviously, as Tegan said, we'll work together to figure out a way to appropriately honor all the work that Paul did, the great work he did. A lot of us knew him for quite a while, so obviously it's a big loss. On the administrative side, as Tegan just said, we will need to figure out who the next chair of A&F is. My guess would be we'd probably take it up later this month before the budget needs to come to all of you in June. So if folks are interested in taking over the chair of the A&F committee, please let Tegan and David know so that we can start. And I would say, that you're interested in why you think you'd be a good candidate so that we can start trying to frame how we want to have that discussion come probably the next meeting in May. So thank you, Brian. Thank you, Tegan. With that, are there any other chair reports that people have? With that, I will go to agenda item 6, the Regional Transportation Advisory Council report update. Leonard?
I thank you, Mr. Chair. And so I would also like to express a deep appreciation for Paul Regan. He has always been supportive of the MBTA Rider Oversight Committee. As you may know, I represent the MBTA Rider Oversight Committee on the Regional Transportation Advisory Council. And when almost yearly, Paul would come to talk with us about the advisory board's report to the MPO on the budget. At any other time we asked him to meet with us, he would happily meet with us and give us his honest opinion about things, and that was always very helpful. So with respect to our meeting, we had a meeting yesterday, and Michelle Ho, who is the Director of Capital Planning for MassDOT, talked with us. We're really trying to get a handle on that period of time when MassDOT is helping to inform the MPO of the universe of projects from which we select, and she was helpful in elucidating that point in time and gave us more of an overview of the process. And I want to express our appreciation to her for that. And we also discussed our draft letter. The 3C committee discussed this draft letter on the current tip, and I think the MPO is going to be pleased with that letter when you see it. So that's it. Thank you.
Anyone have any questions for Leonard? All right, thank you, Leonard. Next agenda item is agenda item 7, approval of the April 16th, 2020 meeting minutes. So I need a motion. A second, you please identify yourself, then I'll ask Jonathan to do the roll call. So is there a motion to approve?
Eric Barassa here, making a motion to approve the minutes.
Is there a second?
Brian Kane, always happy to second Eric Barassa's motions.
All right, with that, are there any changes or comments in the minutes people want to propose? Seeing none, Jonathan, why don't you go through the roll call?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Steve Wolfel,
Yes.
John Bouchard,
Yes.
John Romano,
Yes.
Samantha Silverberg,
Yes.
Laura Gilmore,
Yes.
Eric Barassa,
Yes. Yes.
Brian Kane,
Brian Kane, yes.
Leonard Diggins,
Leonard Diggins, yes.
Tom Kadzis,
Yes.
thank you, Jim Fitzgerald,
Yes.
thank you, Jay Monty,
Yes.
David Kozis,
David Kozis, yes.
thank you, Daniel Amstutz,
Daniel Amstutz, yes.
Sheila Page,
Yes.
Tom Bent,
Tom Bent, yes.
Thatcher Keyser,
Thatcher Keyser, yes.
Darlene Wynn,
Win, yes.
Tina Cassidy,
Tina Cassidy, yes.
And Tom O'Rourke.
Tom O'Rourke, yes.
Motion carries, Mr. Chair.
All right, thank you, Jonathan. Thanks, everyone. All right, we're on to the next agenda item 8, MPO election survey, and I'm going to turn it over to Eric.
Hello, everyone. So during the last certification review by Federal Highway and Transit Administrations, one of the issues that they highlighted was the Boston MPO election process. And particularly what they highlighted was that over the past 21 years or so, there have been a relatively small number of cities and towns that have represented the Boston region on the MPO. And they wanted to make sure that that we take some time to think about that and to kind of evaluate our election process and procedures. So Matt actually took the survey that that MAPC and the MBTA Advisory Board have drafted and put it into a little slide presentation here. So the first slide here is just taking from verbatim from the certification review, identifying this issue. Matt, could you go to the next slide? So this next slide, again, that's from the certification review, and it's just highlighting really the sort of the lack of kind of turnover from the municipal seats over the past several years. Can you go to the next slide? So their recommendation is for the Boston Region MPO to review the voting procedures for board seats to ensure that they effectively engage all communities in the region and result in effective representation. So we thought since MAPC and the MBTA Advisory Board, we administer the municipal elections to the MPO, we thought we would start with a survey that we would send out to the tip contacts. And the reason why we want to send it to the tip contacts is because when we do the election, we send all the materials, both MAPC and the MBTA Advisory Board, we send them directly to the kind of the chief elected officials in each municipality. So mayors and select boards and town managers. And we thought that if we use the tip contacts, those are the folks at the municipal level who are most engaged in the MPO process. And that will help us understand to answer some of these questions. So we have drafted 10 survey questions here that essentially get at how aware are cities and towns of the process, why or why not are they more engaged in it. I won't go through all of the questions. I do want to particularly, and Matt, maybe you can go to the next slide, go to the next one. Go to the next one. So I particularly want to discuss questions 7 and 8, and we can come back to that in a second. But I did notice that just in these questions, I think we also need to ask a question about which municipality does the person who's taking the survey, where they come from. And what we're really interested in today is to have a discussion with the MPO members about these questions. We'd like to get your feedback. We like to hear what you think of this. Assuming everyone is in support of doing a survey, we want to then collect that feedback, and at the direction of the chair, we will make any edits to this survey, and then we will get it out to the tip contacts in the next couple of weeks, and then bring that information back to the MPO, and that can then help us consider making any changes to the election process. So let me stop just at this point in terms of context before we get on to discussing actually some of these questions, and see if anyone has any just questions about why we're doing this survey and that.
Does anyone have any questions for Eric or any of the board members? Tom's raised his hand. Matt?
You're unmuted, Tom.
Am I? Oh,
Go ahead, Tom.
okay, I'm getting off my speaker. Thanks, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Eric. One question. The opening statement, where it's the text from the certification report, that's not going to be included in the survey, is it?
No, I think in the survey we'll have a shorter overview of why
Okay.
we're doing the survey, because that is kind of wonky. We wanted to include it here for you all, just because you obviously know that.
No, that's good. From the perspective of a survey, the only problem I'd have is if you tell them the reason for the survey, you're basically going to compromise the survey. In other words, if you're saying the feds don't think that the feds have a concern about this, I'd urge us to just be blind about it as far as that goes, to the extent. And just a few comments. On question number 1, question number 3, if they say no, I'd really like to know why. And I'm wondering if we could put a why question in there.
Sure.
And it would be the same for number 6. If it's no, explain. And finally, the comment on number 7, I think it's a great question, because that's what we spent, the better part of one meeting at one point debating. And just for folks who weren't there at that meeting, I guess what I'm saying is does it make sense to state the MPO's belief system in this as at least what the previous MPO's belief system was, that by bifurcating voting into towns and municipalities or regions, that does the last thing other than promoting regional cooperation. So I guess what it comes down to is, do we explain why we have what we have, or do you just go with it?
Yeah.
So anyway, that's
okay.
I'm sorry.
I definitely want to talk more about question 7 and question 8. And that is actually that point, Tom, is totally right on. I do want to discuss that a little bit. And so I'm happy to do that. I also just wanted to see if people have other kind of just general questions about the context of kind of why we're doing this. But I agree with you about making some of those other changes too.
Well, thanks, Eric, and thanks, Mr. Chair, and thanks, Jonathan.
All right, others have questions before, general questions before, Tina has a question?
I apologize. It's not so much a question as it is a comment and suggestion. Is this the appropriate time to share it?
Yeah, I mean, I think if other folks don't have questions just about the process, I think we can jump now into actually the survey questions. So that's fine, Tina. Yes.
All right. Thank you. So an observation maybe and suggestion more than anything. In the first paragraph, you have that the Boston MPO adopted this process to encourage the elected members to feel they're representing the best interests of the region. I wonder if it might be better said or stated this way, that we have adopted this process to underscore the fact that elected members must represent the MPO, entire MPO region, ...
Yeah, so for question number 7, the reason why we're asking this is, and Ken, maybe you can, since I know you're on the call, is Ken, raised this issue, I think at one of the MPO meetings. I think we were out in Framingham about the issue of the subregions, should they potentially vote for just the subregions. And so we wanted to include it into this draft survey for discussion with you all. I guess the challenge that I personally have is I really do believe that the best practice is having the whole region vote for these seats and not just having the subregions vote for themselves, because I've always feared, and to Tom Kadzis's point, we did have a long debate about this like almost 10 years ago, when we increased the municipal seats to the MPO. I always felt that that it fostered more of a sense of regionalism, that even though a municipality was representing a subregion, they were voted on by all of the municipalities. And so they didn't feel like, well, I'm beholden to bringing projects back to just my subregion so that I can get voted, that really they felt like, well, I'm being voted on by the whole region. And so I really want to make sure that we're picking the best projects across the region, not just shilling for kind of my subregion. So inherently, I feel that our current process is the right policy. And I just want to be careful that we don't set ourselves up for, if we receive a lot of feedback, that people say, oh, we should change this. And so I would be interested in what others think on this, but I included it particularly because Ken with Federal Highway highlighted this issue.
Just to finish my point, and I'm glad you jumped in. I should have started with the broader question. Certainly, I gave you sort of a pinpoint thought. Stepping back, I couldn't agree with you. I certainly have that personal viewpoint too. And I wonder if the colleagues around the table and the members are sort of generally in agreement, whether instead of a question like this, it ought to be a question of, do you have any, here's what our current process is, do you have any concerns about it?
A more open-ended one, yeah, right.
Yeah. Rather than making them choose yes or no, and then getting into a scenario that evokes the same question we issued or had 10 years ago.
Thank you, Tina.
Thank you. I'm done.
So Matt, there, Leonard, do you want to ask a question, bring something up?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I agree with Tina. That's a good idea. I have a more basic question, though, and that is, I know we have a sense of what percentage of people, municipalities are voting. And I'm kind of curious, as to what that percentage is. If we have a kind of a voting pattern behavior, because if people aren't voting, it'd be interesting to understand why they aren't. Thank you.
It's about, I would say it's on average, it's about 40 to 50% of the municipalities vote on the election.
And about the same ones each time?
That I don't know. I would have to go back. We do save all the ballots and look at them. So that I don't know, but I do know that usually of about, in previous years, obviously it was 100, 101. Now it's like 96, 97. It's about, close to 50 cities and towns that vote in the election.
Right, because if it's a pattern of non-voting, it'd be really interesting to understand why they aren't. But that may be out of the bounds of this, but it's just a curiosity.
Well, actually, that was one of the reasons why we wanted to ask. I think it's one of the first questions in the survey is, are you even aware of the election process? Do you receive the materials?
Good point. Thank you.
I think Joe Blankenship had raised his hand, Matt. There's 3 people that have raised hands that want to.
I believe Tom Bent had the first question.
All right, go ahead, Tom.
Hi, Eric. I agree with what you said. I also agree with Tom and the Tina's suggestion, because I was part of that long discussion. I do remember that when we increased the size of the MPO to 28 members, I believe it is. And it was the point to have more regional representation. So I agree with what has been said so far. Thank you.
Thank you.
I believe Sheila Page has the next question.
Go ahead, Sheila.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I appreciate the effort for sort of the regional look as well. I am interested in question number 1, and I was in that, how are people participating in the elections? So I'd be interested in teasing that out more to figure out, are they nominating people? Are they voting? Have they considered voting running for themselves? And then also, I think it's question number 4. I do think the towns in the kind of outer regions are challenged just because of the time commitment, not only of the meetings, but in getting into the meetings. And so I'd be curious to know if that is also an issue of I guess the question is, if people wanted to run, how can we help them run, I guess?
So even beyond the time commitment, even just like accessing, Boston where meetings happen, kind of.
Yeah, yeah. So like if I don't had meetings in Littleton or something, would that help if we moved our meetings around more or something?
Or if we kept them all a virtual meeting.
Well, and that's true. I mean, these are great, although I love going in myself. But yes, it has increased the access greatly.
Okay, we could look into adding another bullet point there about something about access. Yeah, that's a good one.
Yeah. Thank you.
And we have Daniel Amstutz.
Go ahead, Daniel.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think this is a great discussion, and I think that I agree with a lot of what's been said already. I think Sheila made some good points as well about the access to the meetings. Simply, going there in person can be even a burden for, coming from Arlington, where it would take 45 minutes or so to get into the meeting. So, suddenly we have this ability to meet virtually, but if somebody, like Sheila was saying, out in Littleton or somebody farther out, it maybe they don't feel it is a lot of time commitment, not just for the meeting itself, but for the travel as well. I think that's a big point. I just want to say for now, question 7, I think I agree with what was said before. I was concerned that question or the answers to that question were too it was just sort of binary, is either yes or no, but I feel like a lot of people would fall into a gray area where they're not really sure, or add another bullet to say I don't know, but we encourage people to write comments, so maybe making it more open-ended. And I think so I think, again, getting back to the time commitment for a moment, I think it's what value do communities that aren't participating, do they not know the value of participating or being a member, or they don't think there is a value? I think that's a fair question as well, in terms of I think some communities maybe don't have a very large staff or a big focus on transportation, or very or it's very sort of minimal in sense, so they don't necessarily feel plugged into a bigger transportation conversation. So I think that's also a fair question as to what would make it useful for them to become a member. I don't know, that was just a thought. Thank you.
Thank you.
David Kozes has a question.
Go ahead, David.
Hi. Just on question 7, we of course hold an at-large city seat, and I really never felt that I represent only cities. It's not like, I only think about Boston and Salem and Framingham, and that I don't represent towns. It's not like I don't think about Brookline and Needham and all the towns. Just, we represent the full region, right? So I think it doesn't make any sense for cities only to vote for at-large cities, and for towns to vote for only, at-large towns. So, I just also agree that, we would not want to ask some kind of question that even opens that up as a possibility.
Thank you.
Ken Miller.
Hey, Ken, go ahead.
I'm sorry, what was that?
I said, go ahead, Ken.
Okay, thanks. I just wanted to mention a couple of things. One, about sometimes when you want to do data collection, a survey is not the only or necessarily the best survey instrument to get information, particularly when you want to ask people why. I would suggest, in addition to, there's nothing wrong with the survey, but I would suggest in addition to a survey, perhaps you actually ask the folks that have run and have not been elected as to what their experience was and why they've chosen not to run again. My understanding is that some communities have given up. that they weren't elected and they didn't, and so they've chosen not to even run anymore. And I would also suggest that, so I would suggest that you actually talk to people, whether that's a focus group of communities or some other, or interview people or something like that, get some additional information in addition to the survey to try to figure out what the reason why people may or may not be participating. About the survey itself, I would suggest that a lot of these questions are not necessarily yes or no questions, that you actually provide. Some people have mentioned already, you want to know why, ask them why. I would suggest that you, rather than just have a yes or no on some of these questions, you give them other ways of answering it, whether it's yeah, a little or a lot or somewhat, and then also ask them why. I would also disaggregate some of the questions. For example, the first question, have you currently served, do you participate in the election? Do you serve, have you served? Have you run? Have you endorsed? Those are all separate questions. And I think depending upon how they answer those questions, you would want to know what the distinction between those questions. And I would particularly focus things on communities that have never even voted. As like Eric says, what is it, 37 people voted in one election. So 37 communities are electing, is it 12? I'm not 12 or 14 representatives. And so I would suggest that some of these questions, you disaggregate them, you give more options for answering them, you ask why, and I think the last question in particular, or there's a number 7, I think that is just bundling too much, giving somebody a yes or no, either it's all great or it's all terrible is not, I think, an appropriate response to a question like that. I think there are probably answers in the middle. And then finally, I just want to say something about the suggestion of maybe having subregions elect their own representatives. We have a tradition in this country of representative government. Every level of government, we have representative government. People elect their own representatives. People, even though you have representative government, people are still expected to balance the needs of their constituents with the needs of the whole, whether it's the country or state or city that they are representing. So I don't think that necessarily, just because you have everybody votes, you have representative government, that doesn't mean that people are solely voting for their own interests. And in fact, when somebody is elected to this board, they vote the way, sometimes they try to think regionally. I know that's true, but sometimes they also vote in their community's interests, and we've seen that also. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's the way voting and representatives work. Thank you.
Thank you, Ken. Good, lots of good suggestions there.
And Tom O'Rourke.
Thank you. Yeah.
Go ahead.
Thank you. Just in general, I'm agreeing with what I'm hearing from the other members. I might suggest that in the beginning to just sort of reference the survey as part of an overall, a regular review process that we do is why we're doing it. And then, do you have question 8 there?
Yeah, definitely want to talk about that.
Yeah, so there, again, to Ken's point, it's kind of yes and no, but we're also giving them the reason why it's yes and no. For me, I would answer that no, just because I don't believe in term limits, not because of the bandwidth of the municipalities would be my reason. So I don't know if you want to give the yes, no, and then why, just leave that open.
Okay, yeah, I think that's a great idea. And I hear loud and clear that we should probably have a why box or a place where people can add additional information under these questions, and try to not have as many sort of just kind of yes or no binary. I know that's challenging in a survey, but try to tease out some of the nuance and ask people to kind of fill in the details and provide them with the opportunity to add more there.
Thank you.
Ken, go ahead.
Yeah, just about term limits. I mean, there is a middle ground. You could have a policy or a rule that says that You know, if somebody is, if there's no other nominee, term limits don't apply, but the term limits would apply only if there's if somebody else wants to run. And if folks, by the way, if folks are really thinking regionally, then maybe they would step aside and let somebody else have a chance. Thank you.
Tina?
Yes, just one thought, more a thing to think about rather than a declarative statement. I'm wondering if there's even a need for question 8. If there's a chance that this survey is going to be going to some people who perhaps have never really availed themselves of any of the MPO processes. I kind of look at question 8 and the question that's being answered there about term limits is kind of, to me, a question that maybe the MPO members might consider after the survey, knowing what some of the results and comments were, if they find that, in fact, depending on the wording of the earlier questions, if we're able to tease out their feelings or concerns about the election process, then in fact, maybe what the suggestion in number 8, again, is maybe more of a topic for discussion as a way to address survey responses, as opposed to perhaps posing this question to people who have very little understanding of the MPO process to begin with. Thank you.
Yeah, what do others think of that?
Sheila?
Yeah, I think Tina has a good point, because I think a lot of communities view the MPO as just doing the tip, and so are not interested in the tip not interested in the MPO until they have, you know, a tip concern or a tip project. So yeah, I think Tina points out something interesting that we should consider.
Others have comments, thoughts?
I mean, I guess my feeling would be, unless, and Tina, I think you raise a really good point, but I kind of feel like this was another issue that, you know, was highlighted by Ken and folks. And so unless other people feel strongly that we should not include it or we should change the question, I guess I would say, let's keep it in there, just as a yes, no, take out the kind of the qualifications we have there, and then ask people to provide kind of more of a response there. But I too have reservations about kind of asking a question, and then if a lot of people come back and say, yeah, there should be term limits, and if we kind of feel, again, it would be based on also the responses, I think, from the other questions about, you know, people's, you know, engagement and things like that. But I want to be careful that we're not setting ourselves up.
All right, Tina has her hand raised. Go ahead, Tina.
Just one last comment. I hear what you say, and I'm wondering if, you know, is there a way to kind of recast this question if it needs to be asked? And I hear what you're saying. Is it maybe a question that is, which of the following suggestions do you think might improve the current, I don't know what the right word is, relative to the 3-year terms? Maybe phrase it as a multiple choice, and which term limits is one of 3 or 4 or 5 suggestions. I don't know if that gets too cumbersome, but it's just a quick thought for you to consider, but I'll leave the actual decision obviously to others. Thank you.
Leonard, go ahead.
Yes. So I'm thinking that maybe with question 8, you just ask a short yes/no question, and that is, should there be term limits? Because then, I mean, the rest of it is a kind of a leading question. I mean, and kind of inherently, in most situations, the term limits will increase participation. I mean, I guess it couldn't. We would have a chance that it didn't in this case, but that would be empirical after like imposing it and then seeing what happened. But in theory, you kind of like go, well, yes. And so I would just say, just ask the question, should there be term limits seen? And if you want to ask a question, just ask it a short question, yes, no, and leave it at that. And Ken Miller said a whole lot of things that I would really like to unpack, but it would take a lot of time. But I will support this, and that is, I think we should have something in addition to these questions where we really do try to have conversations with everyone, if someone in each of the municipalities to really get a sense of what's going on with respect to their participation. Thank you.
Brian Kane.
Go ahead, Brian.
And thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to commend Eric for his leadership on this. This is not an easy thing to do. As someone coming in sort of new at this, I think back to, when I was very active in town government, the work that I do with municipal governments now, I think all of us wish we had more people involved in what we do, wish there was more citizen participation in our local governments, in the bodies we represent in the cities and towns we work for. Participation these days is tough. We see lots of social fraternal organizations, golf clubs falling by the wayside because there's just not enough people participating. So as we look at how to get more participation in this body, the MPO, we need to think broader, I believe, that, maybe it's not something we're doing wrong. Maybe it's just the way things are at the moment. Doesn't mean we shouldn't try to think about ways to encourage more folks to get involved. But I do think that the survey is a great first step. I think Eric's questions are spot on. And I think, this is something we should support and move forward with. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Daniel, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to say for the question 8, and this I think relates back to something Sheila was saying earlier about the need, again, coming from a town that has more limited resources than some of the cities, it's, you recognize how, if I didn't have my position here, it would be difficult, just the way that we're oriented or operating, it'd be difficult for us to probably continue to be a member. But I think that, Sheila was saying some communities probably need help if they were going to try to be members and spend that time. I think that in terms of term limits, it's, different from, say, any local municipal type of election where anybody could run, where you're sort of thousands of potential people, where in this case we have a very limited pool. So trying to sort of impose that without addressing foundational or sort of basic questions of the capacity for different communities to become part of or become members, or to, again, to spend that level of time and effort. I think it's sort of, I don't know. It seems like it would sort of lead to, without dealing with those underlying issues. I think that this doesn't really make a lot of sense, since I don't think we're all playing from it's not an equitable playing board that we're all sort of coming from. That's the problem. Thanks.
Before Matt, how many more people do we have to have their hand raised?
None.
None. Okay. So, Eric, where do you think this leads us, and what do we need to do to start moving on this? So, because obviously we got a lot of good feedback today from all the members and Ken. So where do you think we are right now?
So this is great feedback. I really appreciate it. I've been taking very careful notes, and I also want to just point out that it was actually Paul Regan who helped me draft these questions. Brian and I connected yesterday, so I really appreciate the role that the MBTA Advisory Board has played. Brian and I are gonna take these back, and we're gonna connect, and then we're gonna work with the chair to make edits to this. And then, unless there is any, unless folks want to see it again, or if you have any strong feelings, we would then move forward with it. I would say, just in summary, some of the big things we've heard is try not to have the questions be so binary, have more maybe boxes where people can actually add nuance, ask people why. maybe tease out some of the questions that have a lot of different things to them. On 7 and 8, I think we got some really good feedback there. And to Ken's point about, in addition to doing the survey, think about doing a focus group. We'll talk more about that, but that is something that we could do as well. But that's what I'm proposing for the survey, is that Brian and I will take this feedback, we will make edits to the document, and then with the direction of the chair, we will move forward in putting out the survey.
Is everyone fine with that? Does that make sense to everyone?
Maybe folks could raise their hand, perhaps, as a method to say if they agree with that. Just an idea.
That's great.
Yep, I think we're good. All right, thank you, everyone.
Okay.
So I think Brian have your guidance to go forward. So thank you everyone for that. So let's move to the next agenda item. I think we're starting to get a little bit behind schedule, but not too bad on the agenda. So why don't we let the staff talk a bit? I believe we're on this committee's agenda, correct, Matt? I know we haven't flipped to that yet, but.
Yes, indeed.
So why don't we let each of them do their presentations and then see where we are with time. If we do need to, we can have folks let us know, Tegan and David and Jonathan know about which committees people may be interested in being part of if they, but let's just see how the time goes. So Jonathan, I'm gonna turn it over to you. Right now we're on agenda 9 MPO committees.
Yep. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Morning, everyone. Just an introduction here to let you know that the goal of today's conversation is to make sure that all the board members are aware about what the committees are and how they can participate. So the 3 committees that we have are the Administration and Finance Committee, the UPWP Committee, and the CMP, the Congestion Management Process Committee. So at this point, I'm going to go in that order, and I'm going to turn it over to Haral Gandhi, who's going to talk about the A&F Committee.
Thank you, Jonathan. So I just wanted to say that the role of the Finance and Admin Committee is to ensure that the fiduciary responsibilities of the MPO are being maintained and that the policies and procedures are in place. Some of the responsibilities include budgeting and financial planning, financial reporting, and the creation and monitoring of internal controls and accountability policies. The typical tasks for this committee are to oversee the annual operating budget, approve the budget within the committee, and to give recommendations to the full MPO board for approval. In the near future, the committee may work with the MPO staff to determine the financial implications of the strategic plan. They may work with the staff to plan out a multi-year organizational budget that will financially support the implementations of the recommended strategies. Historically, the committee met once a year during the development and approval of the operating budget, but perhaps it is beneficial to meet twice a year or maybe once every quarter. I'm happy to answer any questions anyone has.
Any quick questions right now? All right, Jonathan, why don't you tee up the next one?
Okay, great. Our next committee is the UPWP Committee, and I'm going to turn it over to Ben Muller from Mass DOT OTP. Can we unmute Ben? Oh.
Thank you, Jonathan. Morning, folks. I'm Ben Muller with MassDOT's Office of Transportation Planning. Represent the OTP as the chair of the UPWP Committee. The UPWP Committee oversees the development of the Unified Planning Work Program, or UPWP, which is a financial plan identifying the work MPO staff will perform to support the functioning and the decision-making of the Boston MPO and member municipalities. These tasks are then fleshed out as the scopes of work that the board regularly votes on. The next draft UPWP is likely to be presented at the next MPO meeting, so if board members have questions about the UPWP itself, the next meeting should provide a pretty good overview. The UPWP Committee provides an opportunity for board members to provide feedback and to help prioritize what sorts of studies and technical assistance are performed by MPO staff. Meetings are usually held an hour before the MPO meeting, so no additional trips are necessary, so that's good. Meetings typically occur once a month during the spring as staff develop the universe of studies and tasks and seek guidance on which specific tasks should be selected from that universe for presentation and inclusion into UPWP. And then meetings are held throughout the remainder of the year for occasional amendments. We're likely to reevaluate the formal membership of the committee in the coming months after there have been some changes in who regularly attends the meetings. And we want to welcome any board members who don't regularly attend to stop by. If you have any particular questions or want more info, feel free to reach out to me or to Sandy Johnston on the MPO staff.
All right, any questions for Ben? Thanks, Ben. Jonathan, who's up next?
Okay, next up is Mark Abbott to talk about the CMP committee.
Hi, actually Jay Motti, our CMP committee chair, I think wanted to say a few words before I presented something. So,
Mark, why don't you go first, and then I'll follow up after you.
Okay, so the Congestion Management Process Committee supports and identifies tasks for the CMP to look at. In the past couple of years during the committee, we've done a couple of major things. One is we've done an overall collection of park and ride data. We collected all the data for parking spaces at the commuter rail stations and transit parking lots throughout the MBTA system. During that collection, we counted the number of spaces, occupied spaces, bike racks and bike spaces, and also the bike occupancy rate. While we were out there, we did an additional task was we actually videotaped license plate data to try to collect some information about O&D, but we haven't processed that data yet. We've already shared a lot of this data with the MBTA and others who have inquired about it, and we're currently in the process of creating a memo, a summary of the collection effort, and also creating an online dashboard for this information to reside. Also in the past couple of years, we've updated the express highway and arterial performance dashboards with the new data that we got in 2015 that looks at the congestion times. And during that time, we also wanted to make sure we compare what was going over the history from as it's ongoing. So we've also created a comparator dashboard app that looks at, it gives someone the ability to look at comparing 2012 data, 2015, and eventually when we go forward with this. And upcoming years, we're going to be looking at updating these dashboards again, and also including some new performance metrics in it. We've also supported some various small tests for different agencies. One was helping Massport look at different ways to collect data, and just various items like that. So the committee is very important in helping us guide of what we want to do with the CMP program for the MPO. And so membership is real key, and I think Jay is going to give a little spiel about how we can increase our membership. Jay?
Thanks, Mark. Actually, what I want to say first off was that I think one of the, I hate to say it's exciting given the circumstances, but if there's an opportunity out of the current crisis, I think the types of data and dashboards that this committee has developed over the last few years are actually going to be really helpful and incredible tools as we go forward, knowing that I think the new normal is not going to be anything like the previous normal, and that this sort of data, if we can keep collecting it, keep understanding kind of where things are going over the next couple of years, may really influence some major decisions we all have to make regarding investment in the different modes. So that's what I see as sort of exciting on the frontier of this committee, and even though it's coming at a sort of a dark time in our careers, maybe there's I think an opportunity here with this work. So I certainly encourage folks who are interested in that to consider being part of the committee. I think there'll be some interesting discussions to be had over the next months and years with this.
Okay, thank you. So at this point, that wraps up our discussion of the committees. And what I would like to do is reiterate the chair's piece. If anyone is interested in joining those committees, please feel free to get in touch with me. what I will do is send my contact information out in a reminder email after this meeting, and you can contact me directly to let me know your participation. Thanks.
I do see that Ken Miller has a question, I believe.
Sure, go ahead, Ken.
Thank you. Just a comment, really. As part of our certification review that Tegan referenced, we did talk about having the MPO recommend that the MPO finally develop the operations plan that was its intent from the MOU way back when it was signed. And I think one of the things in the operations plan that would be helpful would be to talk about subcommittees and how subcommittees are selected and how the chairs of subcommittees are elected and that kind of thing. So it's, I think it would be helpful to include that in the operations plan and have some thought put into how the subcommittees operate. Thank you.
All right, anyone else have any general questions? All right, thank you, Jonathan. I believe we're ready to go on to the next agenda item 10, major infrastructure definition. Ann?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. So we'll see if this works with me running the slide. So as we discussed at the last MPO meeting, I'm here today to reopen the discussion about the LRTP's major infrastructure program definition. So we posted 2 handouts on the meeting calendar for you to follow during this discussion. First is a listing, it looks kind of like this, of the MPO investment programs. And then the second is a 4-page background document with information on the MPO's options for the major infrastructure program definition. Okay, let's see if this works. All right, it doesn't look like I can move the slides, Matt.
All right, I can take it over. No worries.
Okay, so next slide.
I need to take them away from you first. Okay.
Okay, thanks.
Yep.
So we revisited this definition last fall after the Destination 2040 LRTP was adopted. As a recap, while we were developing the plan, FHWA informed us that their only requirement for listing a major infrastructure project in the LRTP is that it is one that changes capacity to the transportation network. There is no threshold for costs. So at our November 21st, 2019 MPO meeting, the MPO discussed whether our current definition should continue to include the $20 million threshold in the definition of our major infrastructure program. So the board ultimately decided to continue to include this threshold. So our current definition for a major infrastructure project is the same, and it is one that changes the capacity to the transportation network and or costs more than $20 million. So this issue arose again in discussions as part of the federal fiscal year 20 to 24 TIP amendment when 3 complete street projects reached the $20 million threshold requiring the MPO to do an LRTP amendment. So the question at the MPO meeting was, should the MPO consider complete street projects that cost over $20 million in the major infrastructure program or in the complete street program? Mostly because this would affect the funding goals for the investment programs that were established as part of the LRTP. So we're bringing this back to you today to open up that discussion. So next slide. So this slide shows the infrastructure program goals that were established in Destination 2040, with the major infrastructure program to be no more than 30% of the MPO's regional target funds and the complete street program to be 45% of the target funding. Next slide. So as I said, because of the TIP amendment, we had to do an LRTP amendment because of the 3 complete street projects in the 2020 to 24 time band had reached the $20 million threshold. And that included the Route 126 project in Ashland, Ferry Street in Everett, and the Mount Auburn Street project in Watertown. So MPO members questioned what this meant to the investment program funding goals that were established as part of the LRTP. So just as a note, in both the LRTP and TIP amendments, staff continued to categorize these projects in the complete street program, but we have done the calculations to look at what the program goals would look like if they were considered as major infrastructure projects. So this slide shows the investment program percentages for the 21 to 25 TIP projects, first showing the complete street projects over 20 million in the complete street program on the left, and then categorized in the major infrastructure program on the right. So clearly, if these complete street projects were included in the major infrastructure program, we would not be meeting the goals that were established in the LRTP. So the next slide, Matt. So there are 4 options that the MPO can consider, and these options are included in the handout that we posted on the meeting calendar so that you can follow along. The first option is to keep the definition of the major infrastructure program with the $20 million threshold. So if you choose to continue with this existing policy, LRTP amendments may be required in the future if project costs increase during the development of the TIP. As we've seen before, project costs may increase as they move toward the 100% design, and that was the case for the most recent LRTP amendment. Currently, there are 3 additional projects programmed in federal fiscal years 24 and 25 with costs that are nearing $20 million. They include Route 38 in Wilmington at $19.6 million, Essex Street in Lynn at $19 million, and Route 38 in Woburn at $16.7 million. So again, costs may increase for these projects as they reach final design. 20% or the $20 million threshold, an LRTP amendment would be required. So another issue is that revisions to the project evaluation criteria are currently underway, and it was agreed that there would be a unique set of criteria associated with each of the investment programs. So the $20 million threshold may result in the major infrastructure program including a wider range or wider variety of projects that span across many different project types. And since many of the projects over 20 million are complete streets, it may be more beneficial to evaluate these projects using the complete street criteria rather than criteria that we establish under the major infrastructure program. A second option is to change the definition to increase the dollar amount. In reviewing project costs for complete street projects that have been recently submitted, a threshold of 50 million could exclude these types of projects from the major infrastructure program. Examples of recently submitted complete street projects include the Route 126 in Ashland at 19.6 million, Ferry Street in Everett at 25 million, Route 1A in Walpole at 26 million, Mount Auburn Street in Watertown at 28.3 million, and Western Ave in Lynn at 36.2 million. So the third option is that you can change the definition to apply to projects on certain types of roadways, possibly to only those on the national highway system. You can also consider looking at the average daily traffic on the roadway. So looking at the projects that are in the LRTP and the TIP now, projects that are on the NHS system include Route 126 in Ashland, which has an average daily traffic or ADT of 17,700. Mount Auburn Street in Watertown has an ADT of 20,900. Western Ave in Lynn ranges from 15,900 to 18,400. Route 38 in Wilmington ranging from 12,500 to 21,400, and Essex Street in Lynn, which has an ADT of only 8,900. So projects that aren't on the NHS include Ferry Street in Everett with an ADT of 12,400, and Route 1A in Walpole with 26,100 ADT. So then finally, you can change the definition of the major infrastructure program to exclude the threshold dollar amount. So this option allows all projects to remain in the investment program aligned with their project type, and the new project evaluation criteria can be properly applied. It also eliminates the requirement for LRTP amendments during TIP development when costs increase as they move through project design. And just to keep in mind that the definition major infrastructure must still include all projects that change the capacity of the transportation network. So next slide. So before we get into the discussion, staff did some research on other large MPOs as to whether they include a threshold dollar amount for their major infrastructure projects. So this information is also included in your handout for you to follow along. So those shown on the slide here do not have a threshold dollar amount identified in their LRTPs. It includes Atlanta Regional Commission, the Metropolitan Washington Council of Districts in the DC area, San Diego Association of Governments, and the Metropolitan Transportation Commission in San Francisco. Next slide. So the MPOs shown here did identify some sort of threshold dollar amount under their major infrastructure programs. So the Delaware Valley Regional Planning Commission in Philadelphia's definition of a major infrastructure project is one that has a significant impact on regional travel, and projects with specific characteristics in the operational improvement and system preservation categories do have specific threshold dollar amounts, including roadway projects that improve or reconstruct NHS facilities or facilities with more than 25,000 vehicles per day, have more than 25,000 square feet of bridge deck area, cover more than 20 lane miles, or cost more than $10 million. So for transit projects, projects that improve or make major repairs to existing rail lines at a cost greater than $20 million, and make major improvements to stations with more than 5,000 daily boardings or lightings, or cost greater than $20 million, among other characteristics. So the New York Metropolitan Transportation Council considers major infrastructure projects as those with an estimated cost of $100 million or more. However, for transit projects that do not use federal funds, the major infrastructure project requirements don't apply. For Puget Sound Regional Council in Seattle, along with specific improvement types, they have cost thresholds for ITS projects over 100 million and bicycle and pedestrian projects over 20 million on separated pathways. And then finally, the East-West Council of Governments in St. Louis has a threshold of projects over $20 million for major infrastructure projects. So next slide. So with that information, I want to open it up for discussion as to whether we want to continue with the current dollar threshold amount, change that amount, or discontinue the threshold. Again, I want to note that our major infrastructure program must still include those projects that change the capacity of the network regardless of what the project cost is. So next slide. I'm going to end it by bringing up this last slide, which shows the 4 different options that we can discuss. And with that, I'll pass it back to you, Steve.
Thanks, Ann. Are we just taking a vote, or are we just trying to get to a consensus, Ann? I would assume just consensus, right? We're not looking for an official vote, or Jonathan or Tegan. We're just trying to get a sense of where people want to go, right?
Right.
All right. So Samantha, you have your hand up, please. Go ahead.
Yeah, Ann, I'm sorry if I missed this in the slides, but do we have any projects that are currently in the major infrastructure category that would fall out if we dropped the threshold? So in other words, are there major infrastructure projects that do not generate an increase to capacity?
Yes, there's the 4 complete street projects. There's actually 5. The 3 that we added as part of the amendment that we just did, and then we had Watertown had been included because it was over the $20 million threshold, but it is just a complete street project, and the Western Ave project in Lynn. So there'd be 5 projects that would fall out, and they would just be included as part of the complete streets program.
And what I'm thinking here, and maybe this doesn't apply to the current suite of projects, but if we were to have something that was a really major project, and by major, I'm thinking of both in dollar figure, but also in public impact, but it was a reconstruction and not an expansion, not a capacity expansion, then it wouldn't fit, right? If we only considered capacity.
Right.
So I'm curious what others think, but it feels like when I think of major infrastructure, I think of things that have an impact on a large swath of the public. And I think you touched on that a little bit with kind of size of roadway or daily trips or vehicles mile traveled. And so it feels like we would need something that could capture those big programs or projects that don't increase capacity but are still impacting a lot of people.
Right, and that's kind of what the Delaware Valley Council did in the Philadelphia area. They have a whole listing of characteristics of projects that should fit into this category.
Okay, thank you.
Tina Cassidy.
Thank you. So I've long been concerned about the dollar figure of 20 million because just in the last 4 or 5 years of my service on the MPO, I see obviously what we all see, which are projects that for a multitude of reasons increase in cost. And some of that is due to good practices we've implemented by making sure that we incorporate expected or potential increases in construction costs. I've long thought that the $20 million figure, which may have been very appropriate at one point, no longer is. When I think of major infrastructure, I kind of go toward the larger projects of the regional impact, maybe a little bit of what Samantha was alluding to in terms of Route 128 I-95 interchange improvement, or obviously the Green Line extension was 2 mega projects. And there are obviously a large range in between that and a small intersection in a community. But when I think and look at what some of the projects are that are approaching the current $20 million cap, things like my project here in Woburn, which is a big project, but in the end, it's an intersection project in my downtown, and it's complicated, but that's all it is. And I'm not sure that anybody here or anywhere would, in a general sense of maybe a definition of major infrastructure, ever think of a project like mine as being major. I would, at a minimum, be very supportive of increasing the minimum or the criterion to at least 50 million. And I'd be interested to know why we chose that figure. I don't know if 60 or 75 might be better, but I would be very supportive. I think it's time for us to consider lifting that, increasing rather, that $20 million criterion. Thank you.
All right, Matt, who's next?
I've got Daniel Amstutz.
Hi, Daniel.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I agree. I agree with Tina. I think one of the things for me is when we talk about major infrastructure, is what is the tipping point at which something becomes major infrastructure? I think that's what we're trying to get to a little bit with some different kinds of criteria, because we're essentially using 2 criteria. It seems like whether it's increasing capacity of the system or it's over 20 million, and the 20 million seems like sort of using that as a proxy of something becoming a major infrastructure. I did like that the Delaware Valley Planning Commission had some other more nuanced criteria with it, although I thought it was strange that they had 10 million as their dollar limit. Seems to be pretty low. I would expect it to be more comparative to us. But in any case, it seems like moving the costs or moving the threshold of cost higher would be a good idea, but also including some of these other metrics if possible. I mean, we don't want to make it overly burdensome or complicated to figure out what is major infrastructure or not, but the extent of something being a very regional project that would affect quite a lot of individuals or traffic or something like that, I think would be a maybe better indicator of the major infrastructure. But again, I mean, something could seem be major for a town, but is it major regionally? So really kind of figuring out what makes something major versus minor, I think, is something that we need to kind of decide on as an indicator of which funding program it should be in. Because I think in general that we agree that the Complete Streets projects are very important, and we want them to be, those projects, we want them to be in Complete Streets because we support, we don't want to, we don't want to mess up the the goals that we have simply because of sort of a definitional difference about it. Thank you.
Matt, who's next?
Jay Monty.
Go ahead, Jay.
Yeah, so yeah, I would echo Dan's and Tina's comments that I think at a minimum we can consider raising the 20 million cap. I'm also thinking about sort of projects that are major infrastructure projects that are currently, you know, on our long-range transportation plan, and also those which we weren't able to program, but we have still said there's maybe a window or a door open to fund those projects. So we look at McGrath Boulevard in Somerville, which I don't know if that would be considered a capacity increase. I think, you know, that's anything a decrease, right? So we're calling that major infrastructure, I think mostly on the basis of cost. Am I mistaken there?
No, it changes the capacity, so it doesn't have to increase. So it's a change to the capacity, and because it does decrease, it is changing the capacity of the transportation system, so it would still be included.
So in that case, if we were to eliminate the dollar value altogether, that would still be considered major infrastructure.
Yes.
You know, some of the other projects I know we weren't able to fund, I'm thinking of Exit 17 on the Mass Pike in Newton. That, and I seem to recall when we weren't able to fund or to program that, that the suggestion was made that, you know, that could be still, you know, programmed under, you know, a different category. Was that, am I correct in that?
Right, because at this point we don't know what the design would be, but just with the concept as it is now, it would not necessarily be a major infrastructure project. We'd have to see what it did to the capacity of that area.
So I think a project like that is a good example of, I think, Samantha's concern, which is that's a major piece of infrastructure being reconstructed. So it's not necessarily falling out, it sounds like. And I'm just kind of throwing that out there as you know, I agree with Samantha's concern. We don't want to see projects fall into an abyss because they don't, you know, check that box of capacity change. But it seems like we have some other avenues that we're already using or ready to use. And I just want to throw that out there that maybe it's not as severe an issue as we might think.
All right. Now who's next?
I've got Eric.
Eric, go ahead.
Yeah, just quickly, you know, I concur with a lot of these comments, and I would support increasing the dollar amount threshold. Maybe 50 million is the right dollar amount. Looking at some other criteria too, potentially around kind of the impact with respect to, you know, usage or something like that. But at a minimum, I think increasing the dollar threshold makes sense.
Okay. Who's next, Matt?
Got Len.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have a question and then a comment. When was the 20 million threshold established? Excuse me, established?
Well, there's a history of that. I can't even remember how many years ago it used to be, and it was. And Ken, you may disagree, but we had guidance from FHWA that 25 million was the threshold, and then that was reduced down to 10 million. I think based on the types of projects that were coming in through the plan and the tip, it was reduced to 10 million, and then we spoke with FHWA and they agreed to increase it to 20 million. And then just recently in our meetings, Ken, and you may want to talk about it a little bit more, but you did the research, and basically, you know, as part of regulations, it's always been that the change to the capacity of the system is what's considered major infrastructure, and said at last summer that we really don't need to look at the threshold dollar amount. But in the past it was from guidance, and I believe it was guidance from FHWA for our region, and it wasn't necessarily for the whole country.
Well, thank you. Because if we establish a number at some point, we have to figure costs are going to go up, and we need to set some time range in which we'll say, well, we'll increase that number just due to inflation. I would be in favor of getting rid of the threshold and really hashing out what we really mean by major infrastructure. Because I would like to, if nothing else, be able to explain to people or answer people if they ask me what's major infrastructure. I'd have a good explanation for that, because I think, a decent explanation for a complete street project is, but the major infrastructure is a little vague in my mind. So I like to kind of hash that out. If there is some history on this, discussion on this, please refer me to it. I'll be happy to do the reading. But if we don't do that, if we do establish this threshold, I would like for us to then decide that if a project, let's say a complete street project, is budgeted, a program as complete street projects, but then it goes over that threshold, it maintains the definition of complete street project. And if we're not going to be absolutely binary about that, then at least establish a range at which it can go over that threshold before it then trips me redefinition into major infrastructure. Thank you.
Matt, who's next?
And Miller.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, I think the history of this, I believe, I'm not sure if I was at Federal Highway or I was at MassDOT at the time, but I think the history is that Federal Highway gave guidance about projects that should be able to be advanced constructed. And I think for the Boston region, that number was 25 million or so. And I think perhaps, and I may be wrong, perhaps that somehow got construed to be related to major infrastructure. I may be wrong on this. But in any case, Ann is right. The definition is regionally significant. And the definition of regionally significant are those projects that have to be modeled in your travel demand model for the air quality analysis. And that can be an increase, or as Ann mentioned, a decrease in capacity, but it's not any increase or decrease in capacity. It has to be an increase or decrease in capacity that's significant enough that it has to be in your travel demand model. So that is the federal definition. I think it would make sense. I agree at a minimum to raise the threshold, but I think it makes sense to also consider, as Leonard said, just defining it, what you mean by regionally significant, and then saying that major infrastructure includes regionally significant projects. And, so something like a project on a limited access highway, whether that's an interchange or widening, whatever it is, something like McGrath Boulevard or Rutherford Avenue, projects that really have a significant effect on regional traffic, that don't have isolated impacts in one or a close, dense cluster of communities. And then maybe going down the road, there may be some projects where you could go either way, and the MPO would sort of have to decide where to put it. But I think it makes sense to have the complete streets in their own category. You can then apply criteria that makes sense for each of the project categories without, so that you're comparing similar projects. I think there's value in that. And at the end of the day, there's this MPO, there's nothing sacrosanct about 35% for this or 40% for that. It's up to the MPO to change that at any time they choose. So I think it makes sense to at a minimum raise it to some level where you're dropping out the complete streets. But I would go farther than that and suggest that you call these major infrastructure projects regionally significant. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Ken. Who's next, Matt?
Tom Bent.
Tom, go ahead.
Okay, I just wanted to say I agree with just about all the comments that we had, the last three, about raising that threshold, but really giving us a better definition as to what would be acceptable under this. And I think Ken laid that out pretty well, and Leonard, because we've heard the same thing, that it's a little bit confusing for people to understand what would be considered under this. So I think and I think the 20 million is too low at this time. 50 is probably a better place to be with that. But I think tightening up and giving better explanations as to what would fall under this category, so that people understand what they can do with this and what they can't. Thank you.
All right. Oh, go ahead. Go ahead, Jim.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I agree with, I think, what most folks are saying about getting better refinement to the definition. But I do think there should be some sort of dollar threshold, whether it's 50 million seems about kind of right. But I think, you know, having that threshold, I think allows a little bit extra level of scrutiny for those $50 million plus projects that I would hate to see, you know, ones that are largely that scale that don't have an impact on the network. I think should go through a little bit more scrutiny through the LRTP process, as opposed to kind of very large maintenance kind of type projects that really aren't having an impact on regionally on the network. I think we should kind of have that bit of a kind of check involved, in my opinion.
All right, is there anyone else that would have any questions or comments? Just from our standpoint at MassDOT, well, one, on the history, to Ken and Ann, we're also old, we forget what actually happened, so it doesn't really matter at this point because we all have our different remembers. But you know, as far as we're concerned at MassDOT, we're fine with what Ken's saying is just going back before all this history that we all forget or don't remember quite right, is that, you know, using the federal definition of what major infrastructure program having project having an impact on air quality is, you know, we're fine with that being how major infrastructure is defined. Now, it seems clear to me that at a minimum, people want to raise it from 20 to 50. And then I guess the question is, do we have anything or do we have 50? That's really where we're kind of heading towards. So I don't know what people think about that. I know we need to get Ann some guidance so she can keep going forward. I see Dan's raised his hand. Why don't you go ahead, Dan?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just did a couple of extra thoughts for consideration for just Ann to take back. But I was thinking of, should we have a hard, I mean, for the threshold for the number, you know, should it be a hard number like 50 million, for example, or should it be tied to like the percentage of the regional target funding we have for a single year or something like 50%? Like if the cost of that would eat up 50% or more of a, you know, of an average regional target funding year, something like that. I just wondered if that was another way to look at it instead of having a sort of hard number. The second thing I was thinking is if a project is being split up into multiple years or can be split up into multiple years. I don't remember what the number was. Was that, I don't know if that was 20 or 25 million. I just wonder if that would be another criteria if something has to be split up over multiple tip years, whether that would be another way of looking at major infrastructure. Thanks.
And on Daniel's idea about the percentage, do the other MPOs that you looked at have that, or they just have a monetary threshold?
No, it's just a monetary threshold, and I think that might be confusing for, because that can change every year, so it would kind of be like a moving target every year. So, and as far as the advanced construction, like the Everett project, that would now bring that back into play where that one project is a complete street project, but we've chosen to, you know, fund it over 2 years. So that, I don't know. I'm not sure about that one either. So.
Go ahead, Ken.
The advanced construction to 25 million. There's nothing in regulation about the 25 million. That's just our guidance to prevent, you know, having every project, you know, advanced construction is just a funding mechanism to be able so that you don't, you can spread funding over the life of the project. It's nothing more than that. It's not and it's just the 25 million is arbitrary on our point, just so that it doesn't, advanced construction mechanism doesn't get applied to every little project and just cause havoc in trying to figure out what's going on with the tip. So there's nothing magical about the 25 million. I'd also say that, you know, the infrastructure maintenance or improvement projects that don't change capacity, things like major resurfacing or reconstruction or bridge reconstruction. Those projects typically are not target projects anyway. Those are typically projects that are on the statewide categories, whether it's bridge reconstruction like the Chelsea Viaduct or something like that. So it may pop up occasionally, but it's typically not something that would be funded out of the target anyway.
And I think the only example of that one is the Sumner Tunnel, where we funded some of our money, our target funding, we gave that to the state, and that's really just a preservation project. So that would be another project that would not necessarily have to be listed in the plan.
So Ann, where do you think we are right now? Clearly it seems there's a strong sense that people don't like the $20 million threshold. At least should be 50, which I know that's kind of an arbitrary number, but at least gives at least some sense. Do you need a decision on the 50 versus no threshold, or do you have enough now to keep going and then come back to folks and show people what it looks like? Where do you think we are, Ann?
We can we do a straw poll just to see who is interested in raising it and maybe saying at least up to 50 million, just to see if most of the MPO is on board with that, and then we could go forward and do that, and we can look into other characteristics that we can bring back as defining the major infrastructure program.
All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, if anyone is opposed to raising it to 50 million, say, can you raise your hand? And then we'll figure that out when we do that. Matt, I don't see anyone's hands raised, correct?
Seeing no one.
So at least everyone seems comfortable to move to 50. The question is, do you need closure on the 50 versus no threshold now, Ann, or what do you think?
Maybe we could just do a poll on whether they agree with the 50.
All right. Do folks agree with the $50 million threshold if we're going to raise it? Brian Kane, 2 people raising hand. Brian, nope. Is that everyone saying you're fine with it? I'm not sure I was clear. So is everyone, for folks who are raising hands, are you saying that you're in favor of raising it 50 is the right number? Is that what, can people give me a general sense that raise their hands? Or if someone didn't agree with that?
I believe that's the understanding. I'm not seeing anyone lowering their hands.
Right.
Okay. All right. So I think we're at 50 in, and then the question is, we have any threshold at all? But do we need to resolve that today, or?
Well, I think that vote just tell me that most people would like to raise it to 50 million. Maybe you can just ask if anybody wants to exclude it, and then see what they, see what people think for exclusion.
The folks, so people are raising their hands before I ask the question. So are those people that want to ask questions, or is that people that want to vote to have no threshold, no dollar threshold at all?
So maybe, so basically 4 people are saying 5 that they don't want a threshold.
Okay. So it sounds like we're clear on the 50 and it seems like we can do additional work to see ultimately whether we have 50 or we have none. But do you have what you need for now, you think?
Yep. And then we'll just look at other potential, parts of the definition that can define what a regionally significant project is and bring it back.
I think, Ann, one thing that would be good, sharing the federal definition of what a major infrastructure is Ken talked about for everyone to see it in writing, because it seems like there's still confusion. I think that would be a good help too.
Great.
All right. Ann, do you think we're good so we can move on?
I think so. Unless people have questions, they still have their hands raised, it looks like.
We can do a quick check to make sure. Tom, do you have a question?
No.
Okay. John Bouchard?
Nope.
Okie doke. And Tom Katzis?
No, I do not have a question. I thought I was responding to instructions.
No, you were just double checking. Thanks, Tom.
Oh.
All right, thanks everyone. So
Thank
I think Ann has the you need, so we'll move on to the next agenda item. Just so folks know, I actually have a meeting at noon I cannot miss. So right around noontime, I will drop off and Eric's gonna chair the rest of the meeting. So just so folks know. So next agenda item is agenda item 11, transit mitigation. What's that? Next agenda item is transit mitigation for new developments, federal fiscal year 2020 Unified Planning Work Program study. And I believe Andrew Clark's probably ready to go. So please go ahead.
Great, thank you, Mr. Chair, and good morning, everyone. So I'm here to give an update on the transit mitigation project. We've been working on scoping this project for the last few months, and the high-level takeaway is that staff believes this project, as prescribed in the current UPWP, does not add value at this time. So the objective of this discussion is to provide a little background into that decision and lay out the board's options on how to move forward with this budget item. Go ahead to the next slide, Matt. Thank you. So the transit mitigation project is programmed under the current UPWP. It is budgeted at $60,000. The original intent of the project was to study potential mitigation strategies for increased transit ridership caused by new development. And this would entail reviewing national best practices and then identifying the needs here in the Boston region. MassDOT has also been working on this topic, and we had hoped to work closely with them over the course of the project. However, through our initial scoping, we determined that there was little opportunity for MPO staff to add value to their existing workflow. So to avoid duplicating their work, staff began exploring related study ideas to pursue instead. And as we sort of course correct on this project, we wanted to get board approval on some of the ideas that we had, or to hear if there are additional ideas from board members. Go ahead, Matt. To that end, staff have developed a project idea that we believe keeps with the theme of the original project and will support a number of additional internal and external efforts. And the topic of focus is trip generation rates at new developments. Traditionally, trip generation rates come from the Institute of Transportation Engineers, the ITE Trip Generation Manual. And the data for this manual is collected at suburban single-use sites, and it tends to overestimate vehicular trips and underestimate trips by transit, biking, or walking. So there's limited applicability to the data to urban settings, and especially to mixed-use developments. There are some efforts underway across the country to develop trip generation estimates by ways other than the ITE manual. And these methodologies typically involve gathering site-specific data, like neighborhood density or household incomes, the availability of transit service, and other demographic data. Staff believe a more thorough investigation into these methodologies could be beneficial to the Boston region, and it would also benefit any future transit mitigation work, because for those mitigation programs to be successful, they'll need to draw on data that is appropriate to the project setting and land use type. There's ongoing work on this topic by a number of groups that this research can inform and support. CTPS modelers will undertake a UPWP study next year to examine the applicability of ITE rates to the Boston region. They'll do that based on recently completed development impact studies in the area and household survey data. MAPC has also been collecting and analyzing before and after data from recently completed projects to assess the ITE rates. And they've been working with MassDOT to submit Massachusetts data to the ITE. Now, these efforts largely focus on using local data to adjust ITE rates to the Boston context. But staff believes there's an opportunity to conduct a review of national best practices with regard to innovative approaches to estimating trip generation rates, especially those in urban areas that do a better job accounting for transit, bike, or pedestrian trips. So staff estimates that a lit review of this nature would require $30,000 should the board choose to proceed with it. That will be your first decision we'll have to make. The next question is what we might do with the remaining $30,000. And we have a few ideas for that. One is to pursue a new project idea, and staff has one, but we'd like to see whether the board has others, or you leave the money on the table. That's unlikely to be a popular alternative, but the idea that staff has for this $30,000 is a review of nationwide and international Vision Zero policies. And we think this is timely in light of the recent success that's been seen in major European cities. In 2019, Oslo and Helsinki recorded no bicyclist or pedestrian fatalities in those cities for the entire year. So staff could research the strategies those two cities used and other strategies in cities that have seen significant success. So that's sort of your second decision point. And before I turn it over, let me just review sort of what we're trying to get out of this conversation. The first is we're course correcting on the transit mitigation project. We would like to use half of that budget for the trip generation work, which we think is closely related to the original intent of the transit mitigation project. We would only need $30,000. We have $30,000 left over. One idea is Vision Zero. Another idea may come from the board today. So with that, let me turn it back to the chair and we can sort of facilitate that discussion.
All right, Dan, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Okay, thank you, Andrew. And I am definitely, supportive generally of the topics about trip generation and Vision Zero. But first, a question. How is this, I'm confused, how is this different from what was proposed in the UPWP for next fiscal year, which also has to do with trip generation? I think you mentioned it, but I'm still not clear how these are different.
Yeah, so sort of at a fundamental level, the work that's proposed for next year will take Boston-specific trip data and then work with ITE to sort of recalibrate those rates to the Boston region. What we're proposing is to look at the ways that you could get trip generation rates without using the ITE manual. Because as I mentioned, the data is collected from sort of suburban locations, single-use locations, and it overestimates vehicular trips and underestimates other modes. And there are places around the country that have started to do this, and they have built these models that relies on other site-specific data, like household income and the other things that I mentioned. And so we thought it might be helpful to bring some of that information to the conversation, not necessarily to change any procedures, like they're all subject to a MEPA review, and we don't recommend doing changes to that, but we'd still like to see sort of what's out there in terms of innovating to get rates in other ways. I see Scott has his hand raised, so maybe he can speak more to the
So Andrew, before you move to the next person, like I said, I do have to jump off now, so I'm gonna turn the meeting over to Eric. So everyone stay safe, and thank you for everything today. Bye.
Thanks, Steve.
I'm happy to have Scott more fully answer that if needed, or if he has more to say. I guess the other thing in terms of ideas is, I'm still thinking about what happens sort of after the new normal in COVID-19, after the pandemic, or during reopening. I don't know if there's something. Obviously, a lot of people are going to be studying it, but I don't know if there's some way, if this is in the existing budget or the existing UPWP, to pivot it towards that, since that is obviously quite germane to for right now. So I guess that would be my suggestion as like a possible other idea, if there's some way to relate it to what will happen in the future with the phased reopening of of the state, to economic development and businesses and so on. If some way to move to that, I think that would be especially timely. Thanks.
Scott Peterson, do you want to say something?
Yes. One of the main differences between the UPWP studies that's being proposed for this fall and this work that Andrew's proposing is in the fall, we're going to be using existing data sets, observed data from developments that have actually happened in this area. The work that Andrew's looking at is sort of inferred from different socioeconomic characteristics of the area of different locations in the country. So there are one's inferred data and the other one's looking at observed data in the region. And getting to Daniel's point about timing, there's probably going to be an adjustment period. It could take months, it could take years to get everything back into line in terms of trip generation. Most of the studies that use ITE rates are longer term, 10, 20 years out. So there's going to be an assumption here that the normal may not be the exact normal that we had experienced a few years ago, but it's going to be closer to that than what we're observing now.
Okay, thank you. How about Len Diggins?
So first I want to say, Andrew, I miss you already. Yeah, I'm hoping that you can come to the next CIF meeting for the MBTA, but you have been just so helpful and provided so much information while you've been participating with the Capital Investment and Finance Subcommittee. And I know whoever replaces you is going to be great because everyone from CTPS who has participated in ROC has been great. And that's why I'm just the biggest fan of CTPS. And so my question though, a couple questions. What does leaving the money on the table mean?
Well, so the funding has been programmed for this year's UPWP. And if we don't come up with another study idea, we either leave it on the table or you have to get more creative in the ways that you can reuse it. And honestly, I would have to ask either Tegan or Annette to speak more to that if you want more detail on that.
Yeah, I was just wondering if it meant that we lose it. If we don't use it this year, we lose it. Because another thing is that I would like some more time to think about something else to do, because I agree with Dan that questions are going to come up about how we deal with the recovery, and so it'd be good to spend a little time thinking about how maybe it can be applied to that, because I just have this feeling with a lot of stuff that we're doing, like I'm Wile E. Coyote over the cliff, but still at altitude. So all right, thanks.
Jim Fitzgerald.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to say that I was really looking forward to this work from Andrew and his colleagues, and just want to echo what Len said about we will miss Andrew and Portland's getting a good person to work with them. But I guess first question is, could someone provide an update on the MassDOT work? I completely agree. If it's duplicative to what they're doing, then that's obviously makes sense to not duplicate efforts. Just kind of an update on the timing of their work. I'm guessing it's just because they're kind of a little bit behind in the schedule and their scope of work. So just wondering if someone has an update on when that's gonna, how that's progressing, and when we'll see some sort of work out of MassDOT planning for this, I think, very important topic. And just, I think definitely the trip generation research is also, I think, a great use of these funds. And for me, it's really about someone who works with it a lot. The IT trip rates are really, at least for the projects I work on, are applied as a person trip generation rate. And then it's all about accurately splitting that person trip rate by the appropriate modes. So for me, I think a lot of the important things where we can add value to ITE is all about the kind of internal trip capture rates that mixed use developments are very good at doing. So I think for me, that work should also focus a lot on refining the internal trip capture kind of factors of trip generation. So I guess the first question is if there's any more thorough update on, MassDOT's work for the transit mitigation piece, and then just wanted to say I do definitely support utilizing it for the trip gen research.
Andrew, can you speak to that, or does maybe Tegan might know more?
What I will say is that when we were scoping this project out, we met with MassDOT to understand sort of what they were working on. They had done a little bit of a lit review, and that is the part that we would have been duplicating. Their questions were of a sort of legality, authority, jurisdiction kind of nature. And really, we felt, as CTPS, as MPO staff, that was not in our wheelhouse, and that's sort of how we made that decision. But as far as where they are in their process, I can't really say.
Eric, if you don't mind.
Absolutely.
Sorry, I can't raise my hand because I'm a co-host, so I can't actually do the raise hand function. So I apologize if I seem like I'm interrupting. In terms of process, I figured that I would actually defer to Annette, who does have her hand raised. And then also in terms of maybe more detail on where we are with MassDOT, I think Scott can probably speak to that relatively well because we're in close contact with them. So in general, I would defer to them. I do want to say something high level about the COVID-19 commentary before I turn it over to them, which is just that, we entirely agree with the board that there are these interesting questions evolving about what we are doing both now and how we are sort of approaching thinking about the new normal. And Scott may be able to speak to this a little bit more, but there are various ways in which we're starting to filter this into our work. It's so challenging because of the evolution of this and the evolution of data sources to talk about it, to figure out exactly where the work fits. So we're absolutely open to ideas about it. We don't have anything concrete for this specific study source related to that, but that doesn't mean that we're not thinking about it and incorporating it into all the work we do. So with that, if you don't mind, if you would like to turn it over to Annette and perhaps Scott, if you wanted to add something.
Thank you, Tegan and Eric. So I just wanted to clarify the issue about what happens if we don't use the additional $30,000 or if we don't use the $60,000. Generally, if we don't use it, what it's budgeted for in the current fiscal year, then it just sits on the table. I don't know if things will be different this year because of everything is different this year. That's a discussion we would have to have with MassDOT. If we do choose to do the trip generation research and the board feels that that fits within the TMIT scope, then we would, transit mitigation scope, then we would not have to do amendment for that project. However, if we use the other $30,000 for a project that does not fit within the scope of the transit mitigation project, we would have to amend the UPWP to include that new project. So that's where the issue with the funding stands. In terms of what MassDOT is doing, I see that Ben has his hand raised, and I'm not sure if he was raising his hand to address that topic, but certainly someone at MassDOT is more qualified to answer where they are with that project right now. Thank you.
Thank you, Annette. Maybe we can hear from Ben.
Sure, thank you, Eric. For the transit mitigation scope, I know Andrew's right. We've done a preliminary literature review already, and our questions were more sort of policy oriented and legalese oriented. I know our public-private development unit is putting together a scope right now. I don't know if that's been delayed at all by the current state of emergency, but I do know that that's something they've been working on pretty intently. As to the COVID topic, I also just wanted to let the board know that OTP is starting to look at what this means for our next year's work program, our SPR program, but we're also very much in the formative stages and don't really have a clear answer or direction on that. So right now, I believe we're sort of taking the form of a placeholder here's where we will insert our more concrete topics once we have them fleshed out.
Okay, thank you, Ben. I see Laura Gilmore's hand is raised. Laura?
Yes, I just wanted to second what Jim Fitzgerald had said, that I think the trip generation research topic is really important, especially for those of us who are working on development in an urban context. That would be really helpful just to have another data point as we're trying to right size some of those assumptions.
Great. Thank you, Laura. Yeah, so, MAPC, we are, working with CTPS and MassDOT sort of on some of this work as well. So, to have more staff resources and time for CTPS, that's fabulous. We very much support it. In terms of, if there are, one thing, Tegan, you might even want to talk to this, like, this is something that even, MAPC, and I'm sure, MassDOT's facing right now, is there's only certain types of work staff can do right now. So like staff can't go out and do a lot of data collection, there's like, so these types of kind of, literature review and research projects are actually things that are good right now for staff to be able to do. So we also be mindful of what staff can actually do at this point in terms of working, largely working from home. And I think at MAPC and CTPS and probably MassDOT, we're going to be working from home for a while, probably, 6 months, if not for a year or something like that. So, we just need to be mindful of that. One other idea I would just throw out there, if there is, the staff ability, I know there's a lot of, research that MassDOT and the MBTA are trying to do right now to understand different scenarios of kind of reopening and what transit demand will be and what will happen if more people, are driving and they've come up with some potential standards for, crowding of a transit vehicle. So I don't, that might be something where CTPS could help with some of that technical work. Potentially even doing, and I'm not saying, using like the 4-step model, but maybe even some lighter weight modeling of different kind of scenarios for what you could look like if a certain percentage of people were to increase cycling rates and transit and things like that. So that could be another idea to throw out into the kind of the shorter term body of research.
May I respond?
Absolutely.
Okay. And I see Scott Peterson has his hand up now too, which I'd want him to follow up on this. On the topic of, research projects being a really good thing to do right now, I do completely concur. And I do think that this Vision Zero research was an interesting idea put forward because folks are generally interested in Vision Zero. And there has been this interesting success recently, and also not yet a real effort around sort of pulling that together in a comprehensive way and trying to really assess the key factors for that. We looked at, some of the other organizations looking at this kind of research, and we don't see that yet. So we do think that's something that's timely and could still inform people now and can inform planning, before we get back to the new normal, what do we do when we do? In terms of the idea of doing scenario planning and thinking about the different ways in which we come back to the new normal, I think this will become a very relevant part of our conversation with you all as we approach scenario planning for the LRTP. That's a little bit longer term right now. It's not in the next 6 months, but it's going to be coming up. And we're looking at new and different ways to sort of bolster our ability to be explorative and to sort of understand how we're going to look at scenarios and plan for scenarios given how much, kind of uncertainty and change there is from what has happened with COVID-19. Now, in terms of the very near term, Scott, I know you put your hand back down. I don't know if Scott wanted to add to this at all. There, it's back up. So if you don't mind, I'd like to.
Yeah, please, Scott.
I just want to kind of respond to 2 items here. Just kind of reaffirming what Eric said. There's a number of different projects going on regarding trip generation, and we're working with MAPC, MassDOT to make sure we're trying to avoid duplication and have complement each other's work. So the work Andrew is doing and the UPWP, we're definitely it's all going to be value added going forward. As Tegan mentioned, this in situation we're in now, there could be potential changes in travel behavior, and we are monitoring it through different data sets that we have access to. INRIX looking at travel speeds, the MBTA is keeping track of transit usage, and after everything gets opened again and there's the different phases that happen, we'll be monitoring that to see how travel changes and reassess how we do the forecasting or trip generation going forward. But right now, we just need to understand what data is available and making sure we monitor all the changes that occur.
Great. Thank you, Scott. So I don't see anyone else's hand up, and just to understand, Andrew and Tegan, the kind of the request here is for staff to go back and make a new UPWP proposal. Is that the direction that you're kind of looking for here?
Yeah, so to Annette's point, if the board is comfortable with doing the trip generation research, we can go ahead and write a scope up and start doing that.
Okay.
As far as the other $30,000 worth of funding, whether it's, you know, a COVID or a Vision Zero or a phased reopening, because that is significantly different from the original project, we would write up an amendment for that. And then we would come before you with a new scope for that project.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. I see Sandy has his hand raised. Sandy?
Yeah, I just wanted to mention that we're going to be doing an amendment to the UPWP in addition to the one that the MPO just voted out on at the last meeting, upcoming anyhow, before the beginning of the fourth quarter. So it's likely that we would just wrap up any changes that need to be amended out of this discussion into that amendment as well.
Okay. Would we, Sandy, while Sandy's here, would you be looking to discuss that at a UPWP subcommittee first?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. Great. Okay. So members who are on the UPWP subcommittee would get an opportunity to discuss that at that point. So I think then, unless anyone disagrees with me here, raise your hand if you disagree. Then I think there's support to move forward with scoping the trip generation body of work for 30,000, and then to come up with another idea for the remaining funds, and then discuss that at a UPWP subcommittee, and then bring that as an amendment to the full MPO. Did I get that right? Does anyone raise your hand if you are opposed to that? Seeing none, then that is the direction we will go forth. Any other discussion on this topic? Okay, thank you. So I think the last item, can you bring back the agenda, Matt? So the last agenda item are member items. Do we have any member items? Brian Kane.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just going to mention that there is an MBTA Advisory Board meeting on Tuesday. Many folks on this body are also members of the advisory board, and so we hope to see everybody there. Thank you.
Great, great. Any other member items? Okay, seeing none, can I have a motion to adjourn? Tom Ben.
I'll make the motion.
Okay, without objection, and Brian Kane, do you want to second that? Second? Okay, without any objection though, I am going to adjourn this meeting of the Boston MPO. So thank you all very much. Appreciate it. And Tegan, when is the next meeting? Do we know that yet?
Yes, we do know that. The next meeting is 2 weeks from now on the 28th, and there will be some voting at that meeting, so please do attend. It's the June meetings that we haven't quite solidified, because if we go by the typical schedule, we would meet again on the 4th, which would be 1 week later. So we're just talking about potentially revising that again. But next meeting is the 28th.
Okay, so we will see you all again on the 28th. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.